Hey everyone, welcome in. Betsperts Golf here for our first look at the season's final major, the Open Championship, Royal Portrush, 153rd Open Champion. I'm going to crown the champion golfer of the year. Claret Jug on the line. Feels like we were just getting ready for the Masters, but we are here. Ron and I are, I think, fired up for this one. We're having some good conversations before we even turn on the camera. So I'm like, let's go. Let's just hit live and jump into it. Again, joined as always by PJ Splits 101. Find his extensive course preview on Royal Portrush on the site right now, betsportsgolf.com. What's going on, buddy?
Yeah, very excited for this week. Nighttime coffee golf is a fabulous thing, and so these 2 weeks, starting last week with the Scottish Open, props to Chris Goddard. When you look back at his recent form, you could see it building, but I mean, the guy had two career rounds on links courses. He's from New Jersey, and so obviously we don't know what types of courses he's played, growing up, but pretty sure. And yes, Renaissance Club is not it's not a true links either, but it's just how golf continues to surprise at times where, stacked field like that. And, again, great job by him first round leader. And he literally, battled to the end and beat Rory, beat all those other guys. And so, um, yeah, that's great news for the American team. I don't know about the Ryder Cup talk, every time someone new wins and,
You're
hey,
right.
he's won twice this year. So, again, you got a bunch of these guys who, have kind of stacked some wins, and so it's going to make for some interesting discussion here over the next few months.
Yeah, without a doubt. Impressive showing, to be honest. Like you said, to hold off, it's a strong leaderboard. That leaderboard over the weekend started to kind of parse itself out, and outside of like a Marco Page, who was again showed really well for himself as well. Like kid mashes the ball, his around the green game was really nice. He held up there as well, and forgot her up to, like you said, just not kind of pop and fall back when the moment got too big. A win at Myrtle is a little different than a win against some of the world's best, a lot of the world's best, and he really held up. So it was an impressive showing. There were a lot of opportunities where it seemed like maybe he was going to give it back, and he just didn't. Stuffed a bunch of shots, saved some nice par putts. I mean, Rory played pretty well over the weekend. Couldn't make a ton of birdies on Sunday. That was kind of it. But again, solid leaderboard and a lot of chasers. Again, it was a busy weekend of golf. We had a live event. Taylor Gooch on the live side. We got a lot of live guys here in this field. Really excited to be back at Portrush. Again, they hadn't been here in a long time. It's like 51 years, I think it was, when they came here in 2019. It kind of washed out aesthetically because I think this one pops on the TV a little bit more than most of the other. You get a lot of you get the big yellow scoreboard. You get a lot of burnt fescue, browns and yellows. Portrush, look at me, a lot of green. Be popping on the screen a little bit more if we get some nice weather. Again, the golfers loved this course. For them to come back this quickly in the Rota, which is not commonplace, especially to come back to a place where you hadn't been coming, tells you a little bit about how the field liked this course and what they thought of it. So really excited to be back here. And hopefully the weather isn't a complete wash. That's challenging for me personally in terms of early bets. I know both of us like to fire on Monday openers, especially in a major championship when the odds board kind of reshuffles. And the odds board is very much reshuffled here as we sit here and record on Monday morning. I'm still a little reluctant to jump in. I'm not quite sure how long I'm going to be able to sit on my hands with some of the numbers that I like that are out here. They may continue to drift, but weather, handicapping here can be such an impactful piece in terms of weather waves. Just it's simply just, they run, this is not split tees. Everyone's going off at one. So, you wear your teeing off first thing in the morning on Thursday versus late in the afternoon on Thursday. Like the weather can be drastically different, right? So even more so than other events where you can have weather waves, the way that the Open Championship goes, sending everyone off from one, you're on the coast. And we have had some discussions internally, in Discord, Ron, about these weather reports too. Like, how much are we trusting these weather reports? It's been a little bit wonky. We've seen that historically too. So, what's your approach here? I know we've both made a couple of bets over the weekend on some numbers that I think we were correct. We're going to get shorter, one in particular. But how are you approaching handicapping and reporting more so than handicapping, but deciding when to pull the trigger on some of these outright bets?
So right now, and again, agree with everything you said about the weather. There were a couple of rounds for the Scottish Open that just did not pan out as far as winds in the afternoon, like they said. And so, look, weather people get a bad rep all the time for being wrong. And I guess with golf we try to deal with it as best we can. Obviously, that makes it a lot worse when we're overseas and we know the wind can play a huge role. And that is one of the things I love about the Open is that like nobody's teeing off on 10, everyone's teeing off on 1, and it just goes throughout the day. And if you love to just sit and watch golf, it gets nothing better than this. As far as what I'm seeing right now is Thursday looks pretty windy throughout, and so trying to predict a wave advantage. Looking at Thursday, Friday. I think right now Thursday is the day to monitor. And yeah, like for me, it's either I'm pulling something really early if I like some numbers, or I'm just going to wait it out. And I think not just weather related, but I think there's some guys. We talked about already a little bit off air. Justin Thomas, who I think is going to drift a little bit more. If you like a guy like him this week, and so I think with so many strong elite players up top. With Scotty, with Rory, with John Rahm. Who's catching a lot of steam right now. When you have that, I think it only benefits you to wait because some of these other guys, as they get more momentum, you have a lot of average bettors who, are going to take one of those upper tier guys. I think these other guys in this kind of second tier, mid range, are just going to keep drifting further. And so, even not even thinking about the weather, I just think it's just smart, a really smart week to wait until you feel comfortable, and until you even get more time to research, and if you'd like to take that time as well.
Yeah, look at the odds board as of now, courtesy of our friends over at Gambling. You see Scotty Scheffler at the top, 5-1. 5 is a little bit bigger on Scotty than we've typically been seeing at major championships. Again, the Open has been the one that he has, I guess, threatened at the top the least. I think maybe be the hardest one for him to get over the hump. I don't want to say the last one because he can go out and win this week, and it's not the last one then. Which is interesting because we think of Scheffler as a guy who has the elite, insane level of control of his golf ball. He's very creative on and around the greens. These slow fescue native greens have given him a little bit more difficulty. Rory at 7-1 obviously showed solid form over the weekend. In Scotland, John Rahm at 12. As you mentioned, contended a lot last week. There's in the mix for the live event. Still seeing 12s out there, which were kind of in line over the weekend. To the casual, a 22 on Bryson. And there are 20s pretty much everywhere else. Probably seems very different because, again, we've been going off of single digits here. This hasn't been another situation just in terms of stylistically, something that hasn't fit Bryson's game as much, although I will say deserves a lot of credit for his improved scrambling short game that's showed up at all the majors this season. Your defending champ, Xander Schauffele at 25, Ludwig at 28, Tommy, Hovland, Lowry at 30. Obviously, Shane, your defending champ in Northern Ireland here, going off at 30. And, won by margin here last year, too. And you get into a secondary tier. Terrell Hatton's playing really good golf. Showed, obviously, at the U.S. Open, 33 on FanDuel. There's some varying numbers between 25 and 33. Morikawa, again, this is a range you don't typically see him in. He is a previous Open Championship winner. Seems a little bit lost right now, drifting north of 30. Bobby Mack, and then at 35, and then a pretty solid teardrop to the next group of guys here. Justin Thomas, Sepp Straka, Brooks, Fitz, Neiman, Cantley, Spieth, these guys, Russell Henley, all kind of in that like 50 to 65 range. And that's kind of a smaller tier than normal. So, again, no one currently really sitting in the 40s for the most part. And then a solid teardrop down here. And taking some other interesting names, some guys that are playing some good golf, have had, decent Open Championship. Win equity, with the Rose, Decky, Reed, Scott Burns section here. So, Zalatoris still on the board at Bet365, guys. Come on, be better than that. Fix that. Really, really interesting odds board. I'm going to be monitoring it closely. You're definitely eyeballing a handful of golfers that I maybe didn't expect to when I was, maybe thinking about this last week. But when I started to model some stuff out, just try to think through how I think the course is going to play, watched flyovers, watched, YouTube golfers playing the course, anything that I can get to get a sense of how I think the course is going to play. And this is something we were talking about before we got started, Ron, which I think is a really interesting discussion because we're going to handicap link style golf. We're going to handicap and look at previous results here and previous results at other Open Championships. And I'm wondering how much we really should be doing that because it seems like outside of its location, it's in the UK, it's in Northern Ireland, it is going to be along the coast. It's fescue, rolling terrain, but it's not going to play, I don't believe, like other link style golf courses in terms of, maybe some flatter, larger, green surfaces where you can run the ball up. I don't think you're going to see a lot of, keep it on the ground, roll it up type of link style golf. And when I'm thinking about handicapping links, that's what I'm thinking about. I just don't think we're going to have that here. We have a lot of elevated greens. They're small. I think it's going to play more stylistically like kind of some events we see on the PGA Tour. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I agree with you in a lot of ways. I think it's, going back and thinking about the last few Opens, I think it's similar in a lot of ways to Royal Liverpool and even St. George, just with how you don't use the ground game as much in those two. But yeah, the term second shot course gets overused, but I think that genuinely applies at Royal Portrush, and that's not always the case when we talk about links courses, because I know we're only going off one tournament in 2019. We did not have strokes gained data for that event, and so it makes it even more tricky to kind of figure out, where players are gaining strokes. But it definitely appears approach play is even more critical here than other venues. You have this combination of small elevated greens, you throw in the coastal winds, and because of the elevated greens, you have these runoffs, and that's just going to place a very high premium on precisions, with irons and wedges. And so, looking back at 2019, it's really no surprise you see these two great ball strikers, Shane Lowry and Tommy Fleetwood, who also were both excellent around the greens, finishing atop the leaderboard. And so, unlike most links courses, thinking about like St. Andrews, large flag greens where players can can use the ground game to run the ball onto the greens, and pretty straightforward recovery options. Portrush is just an entirely different story. Like you said, a majority of the holes you do kind of need an aerial approach. You need, kind of this flighted precision, and you're trying to avoid, the green surrounds. And so, and that's another thing you said. You have really small greens here. 5,400 square feet. It's not as small as something like Pebble Beach. It's a little bigger than Sawgrass, which I think are two PGA courses that I think are pretty comparable in different ways. But these greens are also different than links, different links courses, in that they're very undulating, and there's a lot of subtle movements in them. And so,
Yep.
it's like these tightly mown runoffs and tricky lies. They're going to force players to get creative. And I going back and watching the 2019. You see guys using anything from putter to a lob wedge to an 8-iron. I even saw some hybrids and 5-woods. And so, yeah, it's a test many aren't used to, and it's kind of, I don't know if you want to call it kind of almost a mixture between, some of these PGA Tour events, just because of the approach game is so much like what they are used to seeing. So, and even if you want to get into the bunkers, the bunkers are different here as far as,
Mm-hmm.
there's only 57 on the course, by far the fewest of any course in the open rotation. And so, yeah, instead of relying on sand to challenge players, now we don't really see a lot of this on the PGA Tour, but the dramatic elevation changes, these grassy hummocks and hollows that are surrounding most greens, and then you have these towering sand hills. So I just think it's unique in those ways, but I do agree with you in that. I think it is going to be, from an approach standpoint, very comparable to other difficult, PGA Tour courses like a TPC Sawgrass.
The St. George call out too is a good one. That's the Colin Morikawa win. I mean, at the time it was not, an elite golfer, but we was, an ascending talent, ball striking maven, approach god and all that stuff. Not someone you necessarily profiled as a future Open Championship winner, especially early in his career when he was younger. And I think there's something to speak to that. So I just I think it makes a lot of sense. And it's part of it is because that data to look at previous Open Championships and link style courses is tricky to begin with because we have such little of it from a PGA Tour like data standpoint to feed the rabbit hole. So we're already dealing with kind of a small sample, and I'm worried about a small sample that I don't think is going to be, I don't want to say not relevant, but I would think maybe less relevant based off of how this one's set up to play. So, I think there are other ways to use the rabbit hole outside of looking at, I think, like you said, ocean style courses, coastal courses. I think that you can find ways to do that because you're going to get a bigger sample that I think is fairly relevant comparatively to the link style layouts that we have. So you can see here, graduated rough, you can get up to 5. You got to keep the ball in play off the tee. You can see here, high missed fairway penalty, high rough penalty. I think, we have mixed from an off the tee club selection. I think we're going to see that. I think I would lean mixed towards less than driver as well. Again, depending on what the weather is. And I think that in itself brings some different golfers into play. You start to look at maybe some guys that you're afraid of being a little wayward off the tee with the driver. They maybe have a little bit more, success when they club down a little bit. You can see it's difficult to gain ball striking wise, both off the tee and approach are difficult. Also very difficult to gain around the green, and it is paramount to have success here this week. To Ron's point, these greens are not surrounded by, deep pot bunkers, but these mounded hollows that just kind of create uneven lies and very difficult shots. It's an important piece of the puzzle this week. Now, smaller greens help a little bit, but at the same time, like, it is paramount that you are putting yourself in position scrambling wise, because you're going to have a lower than normal greens and red rate based off of, again, difficult to gain on approach, smaller greens, all those different things. But what are your thoughts on in terms of, profiling wise, looking at some of this stuff here? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
So off the tee, I think this is, first of all, there's 8 dog legs. There's not many links courses I can remember that have that many dog legs, and so, I think precision off the tee is another key thing that, and just if you look at the top 10 on the leaderboard, going back to 19, I mean, you see all kinds of ball strikers, guys who are solid off the tee, not necessarily bombers, and so, one place where there are still, a good deal of strategic bunkers is along the fairway, and so you have, those standard pop bunkers in the landing zones. Again, there's no trees to obstruct sight lines, and so, it's going to be interesting to see, especially in this day and age, 2025, how many players are going to try to cut the dog legs. Now, one thing about how Harry Colt designed this course is, if you try to do that, you're hitting into danger areas. But kind of similar to what Pete Dye did, when you do hit to the right side of the fairway that has more danger, you're going to have a much better angle of approach into the green. And so, there are some interesting choices players will have here. Very interested to see what some of these bombers off the tee choose to do, how much they decide to take on. And so, once you, and this was interesting as well, because looking at, what was put out as far as the agronomy, it looks like the first cut of rough is 2 inches high and it's 2 yards wide. And once you get past that, that's when you get into all sorts of vegetation, fescue, bentgrass, all kinds of, indigenous grasses and wildflowers. And you know how it is, how we see at the Open every year. So, I think there is some danger off the tee. I know, looking at around 28 yards wide on average is what they put out, which is pretty narrow when you think about it. And there are 5 holes with out of bounds as well. And so, if how many remember Rory on the first hole in 2019? And so I think that's something that's going to be in the back of players' minds as well. So, I kind of think for me when I'm looking at this, whether it's for DFS or outrights or whatever, it's a perfect setup for players who are elite with their irons and obviously above average in accuracy off the tee. And so I think being able to put your drive on the correct side of the fairway, having that control, again, that's where something like, distance from edge of the fairway, which, obviously we have and can look at that as well. I think looking at that in combination with, who's performed well on difficult approach courses, small greens. Those are kind of be my bread and butter this week as far as what I'm most important as far as looking at.
All right, let's jump into some of that. You can look on the course stats page again, betspertsgolf.com. Go up to the tools section, course database here. You can get a look at all of the specific layouts for what we expect here from Royal Portrush. Obviously, course metrics is a little bit tricky because I haven't come here since 2019 and we didn't have strokes gain data. So we have some basic data from the tour, but we don't have everything. You can see that here as well on the leaderboard. If you click into the strokes gain tab, obviously we don't have everything in there other than just the score. It's a little bit tricky. So, but to Ron's point, you can use different filtering and different conditions to kind of get a sense of what we're looking at here this week. So let's look at a couple different things here. I don't know, in terms of the three at the top that we like to mess around with a lot from a scoring condition standpoint, say it's probably going to be it's a major championship. We're going to need all the clubs. I'm going to definitely lean difficult to very difficult. Again, Lowry won by margin and pulled himself away. So when you look at it in terms of the winning score was X, that doesn't matter as much as what's the group collective score relative to par. And again, that's something you can get here. If you go into the scoring section of the course stats page, you can see, par 71, played 1.17 strokes above par last time we were here in 2019. So again, average score above par. Classified as long. I'm not super interested in like getting into the weeds in terms of course length because of how I think it's going to play strategically. But again, some of the stuff in navigating live data, DP World Tour data, I think looking at, very strong fields, you can mess around with different event types, whether it's, majors, signature events, things that would have, stronger fields. I think those are really important metrics this week to give your, best level set sample of, how someone's played in their last 36 rounds against stronger, very strong fields. I think those are really important starting points. So you mentioned approach on small greens, difficult to gain ball striking stuff. Those are, I think, some important things as well. Let's look at how guys I think we can just do very strong. Let's just look at very strong fields over the last, I don't know, we'll go 2 years to help us get a bit bigger sample for some of those miscellaneous guys that make it a little bit harder on us just to see who's played the best. Kind of starting high level. This is something that, Andy and I refer to on our Tuesday betting show as like anchor stats. Something that you kind of put in there, lock it yourself in, make sure you're going to get, some of the best golfers before you start to get really, really granular. This is what we're going to have. We're going to have some small sample stuff with the Carlos Ortiz and the Daniel Brown. This Daniel Brown is last year's Open Championship where he played pretty well. He's been playing pretty well in Europe this year as well. Again, you can go into this section here into the minimum rounds and shut that off basically if you want, and put on something that'll pull those guys out of there. We're going to have Scotty Scheffler at the top, which is not super surprising. Bryson right there as well. Again, not getting it done on approach, but pretty much everywhere else. Xander, Rahm, Rory, Colin, Tommy, Patty Reed, smaller sample. Hideki, Spawn, Ludwig. Now, this makes sense. You'd expect to have some really, really, really good golfers in there. But I think it's an important metric this week in terms of just kind of you getting a baseline and anchoring some stuff in there. But what did you say? You want to look at small greens, difficult approach? This one you mentioned?
Yeah, just really quick to pick up on what you just said, and I think you touched on earlier, but there's so many different ways you could look at just field strength. Like you could just look at majors, you could just look at, strong, very strong. You go to signature events, you can combine them all together, and it, will weed everything out that you don't want. So I think that's a great way to start. But yeah, I think for me, approach is going to be the biggest thing I'm looking at throughout the week. So we have a variety of options here as well, and I'm probably not going to look at these together. So for example, I'm going to look at difficult and very difficult for approach to gain. So we have basically broken down. I broke down every single course played since 2015. Based on how easy or difficult it was, and so every single course is in its own little bucket here. And so I think this is going to be the challenging part. And of course, 2019 was a if you want to take more of a granular or bigger picture GIR greens and reg approach, obviously this is going to be difficult. And then we have the option with greens, small greens here as well. So probably going to look at all these separately, just because of again, you got 19 live players in the field. So from a data perspective, I think that makes more sense.
Yeah, difficult to gain on approach. Let's just look at difficult ball striking to start, and then we can look at greens as well because it's difficult to gain off the tee. We can also mess around and do this differently too. I wouldn't include necessarily less than driver and mixed in this. I would do it separately. But I think you can look at mixed and less than driver off the tee in conjunction with maybe high and average miss fairway penalty and rough penalty as well, because that's actually important this week. And that's something that we have here too. So we'll start here. Let's get a kind of a big picture look. Again, you can go into any subscriber can go into this view expert ranking section and can look at models from our staff, other folks in the industry that do content. My first run Port Rush is in here. You can see what other people are including in terms of the stats that they're looking at. You can download any of this into a CSV. If you want to do kind of a collective, wisdom of the crowd model and get a sense of what other people are doing, you can do that as well. So this is difficult and very difficult off the tee and approach. So we want to look at ball striking in this scenario, and you see best player in the world separate by over a full stroke over the last 2 years in a very solid sample here. And that makes a ton of sense. He's pretty good. Defending champ in this event at this course. So not your actual defending champ, but last time we were here, Shane Lowry was the winner. 1.33 strokes ball striking. Kevin Yu cannot make a putt. Bleeding strokes putting, but ball striking will be nice. Morikawa, Sepp Straka, Rory, Bud Cauley, Victor Hovland, Akshay, Corey Connors, Russell Henley. You get Xander and Ludwig down here as well. So those guys are elite ball strikers when the test is difficult. It's a great place to start when you're looking at guys this week. You can kind of go back in here, do something similar. I think maybe we'll take off the tee. We'll look at approach and we'll look at small greens because it's something that Ron had mentioned too, just to see who can, greens and reg as well, just to see difficult and average. You just want to pull out anything easy, greens and reg, see who kind of can be dialed in when the approach test is toughest. Like Ron said, overused term, second shot golf course, but this is, I think the best way to look at when that second shot is demanding. Scotty Scheffler, Sepp Straka, Akshay, Shane Lowry, Tom Hoagie, Russell Henley, Justin Thomas, Colin Morikawa, Rory McIlroy, Bud Cauley again, Tom Kim. Basically all your guys that are gaining at least a half stroke, right around 25 to 40 rounds. And again, this is last 2 years, difficult ball striking test. So yeah, anyone jump out and catch you off guard there?
No, it's kind of names I'd expect. Akshay is also very good in the wind. And so that's another, thing you could look at is, okay, let's look at wins, 18 plus. Obviously we don't know what's going to happen yet, but, it's just,
Sure.
It's just neat to have that option to kind of, look at look at every possibility that these players could face this week.
Yep.
But yeah, I'm not surprised by any names. Sepp Straka has probably made some of the biggest improvements over the last year or two, just turned himself into one of the elite approach players in the world. And so, and then it's also interesting to look at the flip side here. Some of these guys like Nico, he kind of has been dominating on very easy courses, and so going to be interesting to see, what we get from him. Had a decent week last week, made the cut at the Scottish, but another young guy who continues to gain experience. So, not saying he can't do it, but definitely hasn't been his strength so far in these stronger fields.
Yeah, this is an interesting way to look at the inverse to mixed sample, but this looking at approach because that's what we're looking at here. This is in line with what we've seen from Sanjay, which is troubling approach stuff. I wanted to looked at Sanjay a little bit last night, and I'm like, man, keeps the ball in play off the tee. The around the green game can be fantastic. The approach is just so horrendously bad. I still think he hasn't gained on approach since like early March or like February or something like that.
It was the Cognizant and
Cognizant, yeah. So, PJ, that's rough. Justin Rose, I think is going to be fairly popular a nice weekend in Scotland. Played well. He's playing well in majors. Played well last year at the Open. These numbers aren't as encouraging for him. Adam Scott, similar story. Harris English, who kind of punted on the first round, otherwise played really well in Scotland. Ben on. Cam Young's got kind of a sneaky, really good Open Championship history. A lot of it is just being able to rip driver at St. Andrews and put himself in top 2. So, like, be very careful with what you're giving Cam Young credit for there. No, he's playing better overall. So I'm not going to necessarily poo-poo Cam Young, but I just say, hey, if you're looking at like, hey, look at his finishes in the Open, I just would say be careful about pulling really anything from St. Andrews, to be honest, because it's just such a different test from what we're going to be looking at this week. Burns, Goddard, Wyndham Clark, Spieth, smaller sample here for some of these guys, but I think it's interesting to kind of look at some guys here. If you got to start crossing some guys out too, and this is kind of one way that you can go ahead and do that.
Another thing, just really quick, another thing I think is really beneficial, especially a week like this, is looking at just recent data. And so for me, like, I think this is going to be a big week where I'm looking, okay, what have these guys done in their last 8 rounds? And a lot of these guys, even some of the, the DP World Tour guys, they played the Scottish last week. So those rounds are going to be in here. And so it's just, I think when you combine all the historical small greens, and then you have to emphasize recent form as well, just because, obviously that's, all of us who play golf know if you're hitting it good, you feel like you can just carry that on. And so, I think for me, I think 8 rounds is kind of just an extreme reason if you want to go, last month. Like, there's so many options on the rabbit hole for time frame that you can get pretty creative. Even, and we have this coming soon, a rolling leaderboard of, so if you wanted to just look at approach, that'll be available soon here, but you can kind of create your own model, a rolling model for recent approach plan. That's another idea for this week.
Oh, I'm muted. Sorry. Nathan Kimsey. Who knew? I wasn't expecting that. 4 rounds. Putted pretty well. There you go. Recent form. Yeah, I think it's an important thing this week too. A lot of the stuff that I have in my model is a little bigger, but like last 36, last 50 with some filtering. So like just some stuff that's trying to give you, it's, I think you would not necessarily call that recent form, but it is a little bit more shorter term form than some of the other stuff that I like to look at, because I think that matters too, right? Who's coming in playing really good golf, confident, standing over the ball. That matters a ton. We know that this is such a mental game, but there's obviously so many ways that you can look at the data here this week. Matt in the chat, whether we talked about it briefly at the top. Yeah, and you've kind of mentioned, wait, never mind, the weather is changing. Like, yes, I agree that the weather is massively important. Now, as you mentioned, rain, playing in wet conditions is a skill. You can go into filter by conditions. You can go all the way down to the bottom. We have wind, and looking at who's playing best in 18 plus mile an hour winds, important. I would look at it and determining whether or not you want to build that as a core piece of your model this week. Until we get closer is a little bit harder, but I mean, wind will be a factor. It's just going to be how much and where does it affect you in your wave. And then, grass conditions, we don't have, is it raining? Yes or no? But we have, is it wet conditions? And I think that to your point is something that's can be important as well. And that's here
and
for you.
Even temperature too, because highs this week are going to be in the upper 50s, and so obviously a lot of these European players are going to have tons of experience, as opposed to the typical U.S. player who grew up in the South or other regions. Again, not that they haven't played in cool weather, but just you can kind of mix it all together like you just did there, and kind of recreate what the weather could be. And I just think it's a neat look to. You're not going to find this anywhere else where you can look at temperature. So sample size, we'll see here, but even just one at a time and build a model that way, I think is another way to do it.
So I would not use this, just sharing it to show you can do it. But again, I would not make any decisions off of 2 rounds played, 3 rounds played. And again, we're not going to have a lot of this anyway, because we just don't see a lot of it. So seeing it mixed is.
What time frame is this?
This is 3 years.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, you
You
probably
can,
have to go individual one at a time, but yeah.
yeah. If you start backing out to 6, 7, 8 years and stuff like this too, it can be a little bit tricky depending on the player. Because just again, you're grabbing data from 8 years ago. They could be a very different player. If I'm grabbing 8 years ago Russell Henley data, see he's made some pretty drastic strides. If he happened to have a round that fit in this data set, using that against him would be, I think, a mistake. So, but again, it's all here for you specifically if you want to take a look at it. And to Ron's point, I would look at them, one at a time. So, another comment in the chat. The most likely approaches between 425 yards as a secret sauce. With all due respect, I don't really believe in that stuff, because I think what you're doing in terms of grabbing data here, and this is something we push back off on all the time. You're looking at like proximity ranges. The only way you can build it into a model like this and is basically painting across the board for every player. So then you're telling me if I'm putting in, X weight for 150 to 175, I'm then essentially grading each player against that. And depending on their length off the tee, their club off the tee, they could very much be in a range that, maybe not having many shots in that range, yet we're grading them poorly because they don't play well from that range. So it's really a tricky way to handicap. I think it's something to look at. I think it'd be great for tiebreakers. There's definitely going to be some instances over the course of a calendar year in an event where it's like so many approach shots, regardless, based off of what they force you to do off the tee. Everyone's hitting approaches within this 25-yard range at a 45% clip. Then I think it's useful to have, and that's why we have it. But I think just in general, on a course like this, where the strategy off the tee can vary so much and the style of the player can vary so much, painting with a broad brush like that, I think, is personally a mistake. And then you say it here as well, numbers do lie, will lead you to make the wrong picks. I think leaning on the other suggestion will force you into maybe some wrong suggestions. So careful with that. And again, this is a lot of data. It's overwhelming to some people, and finding out ways is why we kind of try to do content this way, is try to show you how we're using it, because by itself, some of it can be really intimidating and you don't know up from down. That's why we have the ability for you to look at expert models, see how people are building models, see what stats they're using, because as a blank canvas, it's overwhelming. It's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and there's just so many unknowns this week, on top of everything else. So it's just, some weeks simpler is better, and this is definitely one of those weeks where you want to focus in on approach like I am. There's a myriad of ways you can do that, but some of the other stuff, like, you just don't know for sure where the approach ranges are going to be. I think some players like Rory are going to be aggressive off the tee still. He's going to have a lot shorter approaches into these greens, and so this is a week I'm kind of steering clear from that for sure.
Yeah. And I think too, as the week goes on, if there starts to be some collective groupthink that's not necessarily being echoed from the course, I think be careful with that too. So, whether that's a DFS discussion and you start to get, some chalk, I'd be very careful in terms of if people are becoming chalk based off of perceived stylistic fits, because we're dealing with such a small sample of what we expect and what we've seen from this course. So I think there could be some opportunities within that as well. So one of the things I'm looking at this week that I think matters a little bit, I have it in my model. I was telling Ron about it a little bit too. Well, first I'll turn on very strong fields, because I think looking at a lot of stuff this week through the lens of that is really important. If I'm going to then build some different things out, like Chris Goddard, for instance, and maybe what I'm going to pull would bring in Myrtle Beach field. I don't really want that in my data this week. I don't think it's super relevant. So just by starting eliminating other stuff by just looking at very strong fields, you can even include strong if you wanted to, get your sample size a little bit bigger. I think, yes, second shot course, but you were almost dead on arrival if you were not playing from the fairway, or maybe that first cut, to your point, Ron, if it's 2 inches, and then we start to get into some really gnarly up to 5-inch stuff. So I want to look at maybe some less than driver stuff. If guys are clubbing down, the non-aggressive guys off the tee, have mixed as well. So again, we're not looking at just guys banging 4-iron off the tee, but some mixed stuff as well. And then there's a high miss fairway penalty here, and there's a high rough penalty. So who plays their best puts themselves in position when this is the demand. I think this matters quite a bit this week. So we start to look at, just distance off, from the edge of the fairway or just driving accuracy. I think those things matter, but I want to look at ball striking here and get a sense of who's performed best. This is a pretty small sample. I had a bigger sample. Let me look at what I had here in my model, because I had, I think, a little bit bigger. So look at 2 years, 50 rounds. I didn't mess around with the field strength, so I'll pull that off and get us a little bit of a bigger sample. So that's going to help. Again, high rough penalty, high missed fairway penalty. You are naturally taking up some of the, I guess, bombing gouge fests that we would see on the PGA Tour. This should get us a little bit of a bigger sample of guys. What am I looking at here? What's throwing me off? Off the tee, driver, less than driver. Mixed, high missed fairway penalty, average. This should be. Oh, I only have last 8 rounds on.
There you go. Yeah, I didn't see it either.
I'm like, what's going on? I'm like, why do I? Because I'm getting 50 plus rounds for most of these guys. So we'll go last 50 here, looking at ball striking in the sample. Yeah, you can see most of these guys have it. So we'll do minimum rounds. We'll pull the Hendrick Stensons of the world out and see who's done best. Now you can look at off the tee here, or ball striking specifically, I think is the best test. Because it's kind of telling us a little bit about their second shot as well. It keeps them in play. Scotty, Bryson, small sample against Scotty by margin. Colin, Rory, Rahm, Hatton, Hovland. This bodes well for Corey Connors. Here's Lowry again. Brooks on a small sample. Neiman on a small sample. Xander's not surprising. There's an Aaron Rye, Tom Hoagie. There's Sepp again. Justin Thomas, Akshay. So not a ton of surprise. When you look at, off the tee here specifically, Laurie Cantor in a small sample. There's Ludwig at the top, Corey Connors again. Here's Sanjay. Again, this is the Sanjay stuff. It's like, and the off the tee stuff is nice. Around the green is nice. This is just untenable. Here's Johnny Vegas, which is probably a little surprising. Pot Geeter on a smaller sample is more Kevin Yu. So I think this is an interesting kind of sample of looking at things this week as well. It's kind of a piece of my model this week.
Yeah, one thing, I guess we can shift gears here. One thing I think is really important also that kind of ties with the approach game. And if you're missing greens, you're going to be in trouble to begin with. But I think around the green is hugely important this week. So, watching these holes again, like it's short grass. You're short grass chipping, whether you choose to use, different clubs or whatnot. But your ability to recover here from, these hollows, these areas below the green where you are going to have to most likely chip majority of the time to get back in position. And the greens are not easy either. Again, a lot of subtle undulations. They're really interesting pin positions they can use. And so, yeah, I'm looking at around the green, and I think the focus. We have that one filter in the rabbit hole where you can also look at difficult short grass. And so, I think scrambling from that area is going to be hugely important this week.
I love it. Yeah, I looked at that too. Let's take a look for sure. It's just high level, no filtering. Last 12 months, last 50 rounds around the green. Again, small sample for Bryson. It's been good. Marco Penge, as I said earlier, showed that yesterday. Got a little Bryson in him, right? Hits the ball a mile. Is being able to scramble around the green, which is nice. Sanjay, Mateo Menacero popped here a little bit last year. Matt Wallace is great around the green always. Here's Hideki, fascinating human being and golfer. Never know what to do with Hideki. Rahm bodes well. Keegan, Henley, Hatton, Fleetwood. That's encouraging. Matthew Jordan's, just kind of a DP World Tour staple. Played some good golf. Pops occasionally in Minwoo. Scotty. Jason Day played well last year at the Open. Jordan Spieth. So, standard short game, recent form. Now you can go into the things that Ron's talking about. You can go into if we go into around the green, you can get scrambling from, you see here from the rough, slide over and you can get it from the short grass as well. Just want to see who's done the best there. Again, scrambling's got an element of putting into it as well. So some of the same guys. There's Nicola Højgaard got himself in with some good play last week in Scotland. Tommy, Goddard, Kanaya, Spawn, Berger, Rory, Scotty, Harry Hall. But then you can start to look at it through the filtering. I want to look at just difficult around the green. You can kind of look at it here too if you wanted to look at some of the other stuff around the green. It's difficult, very difficult to gain around the green. I believe we have. Let me see.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, you can see all the stuff is graded as difficult. Very difficult to gain around the green at all. So I think that's another way for you to look at it too. So you can just go in here. Scrambling short grass is difficult. Getting around the green in general is very difficult. So just without the short grass stuff, we'll just look at difficult, very difficult around the green. We'll see who is better at that. We'll see. Have to kind of kick the sample out maybe a little bit to get 50 rounds on some of these guys. We go even 2 years, see how close we can get to, say, 40 rounds on most. That's a good way to look at it. Cam Smith, Patty Reed, Ty Hatton. Again, small sample for these guys. Scheffler up here as well. There's Bryson, Stu Sink. Stu Sink played pretty well last time they were here as well. Obviously playing now on the Champions Tour. There's Sanjay again, Seabez, Hideki, Max Gracerman, ZJ, Henley, Davis Thompson. Finau played well here last year, or last time we were here at Portrush. Sam Burns, Day, Scott, Rahm. Again, this is when the around the green is a difficult test. So that's of interest. We can pull that off and just look at when it's difficult to on the short grass, because I think that's what Ron's saying we're going to see even more of. So scrambling, short grass, and again, scrambling, a little element of around the green, or I'm sorry, putting as well. So looking just around the green in that sample, Smith, Scotty, JT, Hatton, Reed. There's Davis Thompson again, Bryson, Sanjay, Seabez, Finau. Now, if we scroll over specifically, look at scrambling on the short grass, which is what we're looking at. See who's doing best here. There's Patty Reed again, ZJ, Colley, Davis Thompson, Poston, Rory, Aaron Rye, Sam Burns, Hideki, Berger, Dietrich. There's Hatton, Fitz. These guys are kind of all right around 62 and change, above 60%. So these are all important. How you want to weigh them, how you want to break them down, filtering. These are all the options that you have this week, but these are important reasons. Again, read Ron's preview. Go through it, get the details. So I think it's a lot of different ways to skin the rabbit this week.
And really quick,
yeah,
I was just say really quick, if you want to take the putting out of it, that's where the arc proximity comes in. And so this is not going to show you every short grass shot. It's going to show you obviously a combination, but just give you an idea of who is chipping the ball close to the hole. And kind of for the bad putters, this would be something helpful to them because it's going to create a shorter putt. And so I think arc proximity is a very underrated stat, and it's going to kind of give you maybe the clearest picture of all of who the best are at chipping.
Zach Johnson, Scotty Scheffler, Justin Thomas, JT Poston, Michael Kim at the very top of that. So, and again, color tiers here based off of field averages is a small subset of guys that can handle this well. An interesting group for sure. Some names that are very intriguing. The Scheffler thing is fascinating. I mean, 5-1. It's not something that I'm dying to do. We're talking about like controlling your golf ball off the tee, second shot golf course, playing into elevated greens, right? He's not having to, well, I think he can. It seems to be something that's maybe tripped him up a little bit. He's not going to have to use the ground. He's going to be able to flight the ball in. He's got plus distance if he needs it. Like, yeah, he's always terrifying to not be on. I don't care what course we're at.
Yeah, and maybe this course is a little less unpredictable than most links courses. Like I know he complained about Pinehurst last year, getting some bad lies, and so obviously that can happen this year as well. Obviously, the fairways are very undulated. You could end up in a bunker after a good drive, but I think it's interesting. If that number continues to creep a little higher, I think I'm not going to personally do it, but it does make for an interesting choice.
It does. Matt McNeely, the question from Matt in the chat. I He's 37th in my model. And you have access to that if you want to take a look at it. Yeah, not a guy that I'm necessarily targeting. Some of the, like, recent ball striking in the wind. He did pretty well for me. Just from the edge of the fairways, kind of middle of the pack, around green, just okay. The putting's been worse than you think. If you look into Mav a little bit, it's not been as strong as it's been in years past. So, not a name for me this week, but I'm back and forth on how I'm going to approach this week from an outright standpoint. I think I might end up skipping more of the top tier than I thought. I thought I would take a shot with someone closer to the top, and I might maybe start in the 30 range and have a few more guys than I was expecting. So I'm not quite sure yet, but Mav probably not currently on the short list. So unless something changes and I find something else that's pro Mav, he will not be on it. So, all right, buddy. Anything else for the folks before we wrap? We went almost a full hour for him today.
Yeah, don't forget about the floor ceiling filter, the finish position. There's so much, like, you could just go down different, burrow. You could just dig so many burrows into the ground, just by looking at those. And I think there's so many ways, for looking at, if you're playing DraftKings this week, DFS, looking for ceiling type players, players who finished high, on coastal courses. There's just so many options to look at. So, if you like to get really deep in the weeds, like we do, man, you can do it all here in the rabbit hole.
Yeah. Gino, great question. Lag putting on slow greens was a very correlated stat last week. Anything you see there this week? Slow greens, I think you would agree wrong, but lag putting probably not as much because we have fairly small greens and probably low greens and red grape.
Yeah, smaller greens, and again, these greens have edges that are trailing off into these runoffs, and so I don't think you're going to get a ton of long putts. Definitely slow greens. There's not that many courses on tour. You're going to get a lot of the same. Obviously, these links courses are going to have them. Coastal courses are going to have slower greens. So definitely probably need a wider sample for that. But yeah, slow greens for sure. They're going to be running about 10 on the stim meter, which is about as slow as you'll see on the PGA Tour.
Yeah, you can see here. Pop this up real quick. We don't have all the data, as we said, didn't have strokes gain data, but not a huge 3-putt avoidance compared to a standard PGA Tour event, and not because the greens aren't difficult, but part of it is just because they're smaller, right? So, the lag putting stuff is going to matter less, and like Ron's saying, those are going to be chip shots, right? And depending on how they decide to navigate that, whether it's with the putter, with the hybrid, with a lob wedge, that's going to be up to the player. But those lag putts this week are going to be actual chips because you're off the green. So recent putting form and putting on small greens would be how I would do that personally. Because again, if you try to get into the native, it's such a small sample for a lot of these guys. I think you can look at it, but I'd be very careful. I'd look at just baseline putting, maybe putting into slower greens. Albert, does Apex come into play this week? I could see it against smaller greens, harder to hold, depending on if you lay back a little bit. And again, that's tricky because, again, you can get into miscellaneous metrics. You can see apex height because the wind becomes problematic, right? So all of a sudden, you're going to have guys maybe flighting it down, even though what their apex height is on a standard PGA Tour event without, insane conditions. They might have a different approach to their approach shots this week because of the wind. So it could be something to look at. Is it something you're considering, Ron? Is it any part of what you looked at so far?
No, but I can definitely see it if winds are calm. So if
Right.
winds are not, blustery, I think, with it being elevated greens, having to take an aerial approach, and just obviously you want to hit your ball higher to get it to stop quicker. So I think it's something interesting to keep in the back of your mind, but I think a lot of it just depends on, as we get closer, what the weather looks like.
Yeah, not a bad. Again, another thing that I would maybe look at, depending on how the weather breaks, like Ron said, You can decide how much you want that to be a part of, of your model. You can see, like, I mean, Ricky showed pretty well here last time. Apex Heights is up there. Keegan's a big Apex guy, and a lot of this, guys with some distance off the tee often show pretty well from an Apex standpoint. So, all right, at BetSperts Golf on Twitter, betspertsgolf.com. If you want to subscribe, promo code summertime, one word, summertime, get you a month for $10. You can dig into all this data yourself. You can read Ron's preview. You can read my betting article. You can look at other people's models. You can get in the Discord, fantastic Discord with a lot of sharp people that are betting golf, talking about golf. You can jump in there, and again, for just $10, get a sense of what that is, see if that's something you'd want to do moving forward. I think we're doing our best to continue to add things to make it the best resource that you can in terms of learning about these golf courses, handicapping these golf courses, betting, DFS. Ron's DFS coverage is extensive. His in-round stuff is as good as anything that's out there. Again, summertime promo code for just $10 for your first month. Check that out. So subscribe to the channel here on BetSperts Golf on YouTube. You can come back on Tuesday. Check out Andy and I to discuss more bets. I'll see if we have more bets, or sometimes Andy comes in blind with nothing. Not sure how to approach, like I said at the top, with the weather, and trying to hold off and not make plays. Again, BetSperts Golf, wherever you listen to podcasts as well. So appreciate you hanging out with us today. Good luck to everyone this week. Thanks for